isn't just limited to American Sign Language and English. It can include any other language. But my true focus was on people learning two languages at the same time. And how do they do that simultaneously? We had many big discussions in graduate school. You know, everyone had different perspectives. Some perspectives that you had to go through learning languages as a young child. Some parents learned English and Spanish and taught their children that at the same time. Some used Spanglish, as they called it. But, you know, everyone has their own way of learning. Motherese is another language. Is that truly a language? It is, because it's very powerful. It's the bond between mother and child. And they have their own way of communicating, their own language. And that's the same with other languages as well. Motherese applies to ASL in English, Spanish, French, a myriad of other languages. Any that you can think of. But right now, I'd like to take a step back and think about how it applies to deaf children. Bilingual, what does that mean? What is the broad view of that? It means you have access to both languages, English and ASL. And does it mean only reading and writing English? No, it also includes, along with reading and writing, is spoken and listening. It includes it all. Does that mean you must be able to do all of them as a young child? Be fluent and skilled and learn how to speak? I mean, it's okay if you can. The point is that you're learning to read and write English along with being able to communicate. And to have equal respect and equal opportunities in both languages. So we need to introduce that concept in schools. And being bilingual doesn't always mean SIMCOM, simultaneous communication. That is a mode of communication, and it's very fragmented. It's a messy language, and children can become quite confused and get lost often in SIMCOM. I mean, if I saw someone that I met that was fluent in SIMCOM, I would be quite surprised, because the tendency is to drop the sign and go back to your primary language, because that's what you connect with and that's what you're able to process quickly. And the grammar structure isn't the same between ASL and English. For example, in ASL, you tend to start sentences with time. That's the first concept. And then you expand on it. But with English, time is not first. It can be moved around within the sentence. And I want to emphasize that English is one of the most complex languages in all the world. So learning both together is fascinating. It's more interesting, it's more challenging for all the children and their family members. And some family members learn ASL much later, so it takes time, and they do ASL in the English word order, and that's the route they take. And that's fine, because the point is to have both languages available to the children. So let's go back to ASL as an entity and then English as an entity. And how do we introduce this to children? Not through SIMCOM. Instead, what we do is we emphasize a language plan. A language plan is developed by a team, not just the parents, but a team including parents, teacher, administrators. And you set ground rules and a framework. Example, out at recess, they're on the playground, lunchtime, you know, when to sign, when to speak. And children who are profoundly deaf, of course they'll be using their sign in those venues. But in the lunchroom, possibly, they could be exposed to signs up on the wall that have English captions. Some use texting. Then, of course, there's Facebook and social media, Twitter, all those things we don't want to discount. They're important to be included. TV captioning is also important. Kids need to see the English language and see that relationship of the two languages together. One of my favorite stories was when I was working with another teacher, as myself was a teacher, and we were discussing language issues. And one point that was brought up in my research focused specifically on captioning for middle school age kids and how it impacted them with their vocabulary development. So we thought about that, and we thought we'd make a pre-test and a post-test situation. So we picked some clips of TV shows, 30-minute clips, and we wanted to make sure that the captioning fit their reading level, so 6th, 7th grade, sometimes 5th and 6th grade. And we'd set up that vocabulary to match the show. And the pretest would include 10 vocabulary words from that clip. And didn't have any meaning, no guidance, it was just there for them to review. And then they watched the clip and took a post-test. And the post-test had the same 10 words. We wanted to see if they caught the words in the clip. And it was amazing the percentage of knowledge that was increased from pre-test to post-test. So after each movie, we had a discussion and an interview about it. And the things we discussed were, what did you think of this story? What did you observe? Were any of the words challenging to you? And some said yes, some said no, so we had discussions with that. And then one of the students said, what does this word mean, backstabbing? That was quite interesting to me. I was a bit surprised because these are all 7th and 8th grade students. And they use that sign on a regular basis in school. So that means that they don't see the connection between the English word and the sign itself. So I wrote it up on the board. And then, some seemed to know what it was. But I'm like, come on, give me the sign for that word. Give me the sign. And then they asked for a meeting, and they said it's if you get back at someone else or do something to someone else. But no one seemed to give me the sign for it. So I gave them the sign. Oh, did their expressions change? They couldn't believe they've been using this sign all the time, but they didn't have an English word to put to it. They go after each other all the time and use these kinds of words. And now they have an English word to attach to that sign. So that proves my point, is children really need to have access to both languages and to connect them. So we need to encourage them, guide them, teach them. Parents and friends, family, whoever it is, need to give them the sign and expose them to the English word that matches. Kids are playing and having fun with vocabulary. We can do that with them and build their confidence. They're not going to pick up ASL and English on their own. It's important to have that guidance and support and the exposure and instruction. Look at hearing children. Their students, they have a formal English classroom and they must take it. It's required of them. But where is it for the deaf? Where is their formal instruction on ASL? A sign academy would be really important. So it's something for you to think about. We need to talk more about this. And we need to be collaborators in our community so that in the future our children are able to be exposed to a myriad of things, what school looks like, etc. Do you have a question?
In the classroom, you teach 50% English and 50% ASL. How does that work?
In the classroom, yes, we do teach 50-50. And what that looks like is by developing a language plan, we are able to set structure within our day for both ASL and English. Unfortunately, many deaf students arrive to school at a young age with very limited access to ASL and English as well. So, their families don't sign much until later on. So they arrive and we really need to reel them in and help them get caught up to social ASL. And then we can move on to academic ASL, then reading English, and then writing English. So those are 4 tasks that we have to work on, and that's overwhelming. So in kindergarten, we really focus on social ASL first, and that's the majority of the time, and then academic ASL is less. As time moves on, those ratios tend to balance out, and their English improves and grows along with it. And then the social ASL, it does not diminish. That is ongoing, even in the classroom. It's just that the academic ASL exceeds it. And the kids learn when and where and how to use both ASLs. And right now in the classroom, you know, we start with ASL exposure and we use it all the time, identifying words, classifiers. We use the classifier game to really introduce classifiers to them. You know, we give them a hand shape like A. And then we say, okay, you know, what other signs have the same hand shape? Girl, tomorrow, etc. And then we take that and we write it up on the board in the English word so they can make those connections. See, it's constant exposure. You know, so it might be 80 to 20%. And then you get into first and second grade and it becomes closer to a 50-50 percentile ratio. And sometimes maybe even might be 80-20 or 60-40. But we're always giving them ASL. We're always giving them English on the blackboard. We're using sign all the time. We're exposing them to books. But it's really important is that they connect both languages. For those kids who really benefit from verbal language, we have allocution for that. You know, we build up time for specific parts of the day. Allocution is, you know, we set up for the deaf students in the classroom who really need English or ASL or verbal language. And some parents get upset by that because they think we're only focusing on spoken language. But really there's just not enough knowledge or understanding. So we can't just do lip reading. We need to use all of the skills and expose the children to all those skills. And so kids can really fluctuate between their different skills. We include it all together, and it's always ASL. And then for those kids who can't benefit from spoken English, we need to be fair to everyone and provide the ASL. So we'll do story times in ASL, and then we'll back it up with the spoken and the reading part of it. And then we'll switch back to math, and it'll be a mix of spoken English and sign. And what's most important is the attitude that these children have towards language, the mutual respect they have of each language, and so they can develop an understanding. You know, we don't want them saying, oh, English is worse or better than ASL, ASL better than English. That's not the attitude we want to encourage for them. We don't want anyone to feel oppressed. We can't afford to have that kind of attitude in our community. We truly can't. We need to have equal respect. That's why teachers play a really huge role in the language plan, in building that attitude and the elocution. Those three elements are so important. And then you can move on to really teaching.
How many hearing students are involved in that program? Do you currently have any hearing students?
No, there are not any hearing students in that program right now. However, at the Clerk School in Tucson, many years ago, I would say more than 15 years ago, probably, Dr. Sam Sapella and his team set up a school for deaf and hearing children to be included together. And my son was actually one of the students there for 2 years. It was fantastic, a great model. And it was ASL 100% for language instruction. Let me tell you, by the end of the year, observing these children, you had no idea who was deaf or who was hearing. They all looked the same because they were so incredibly fluent in ASL. You know, some kids would get tired throughout the day and not want to use their signs and want to use their first language. And so the staff would have to encourage them and then remind them that you also need to follow the rules and use both languages. And it was an ASL environment, you know, and the kids who were profoundly deaf had no problem doing that. And then, of course, there were kids who struggled with finger spelling, you know, and there was groups of kids that were SODAs, SODAs, siblings of deaf adults, and CODAs, children of deaf adults. And then, of course, the kids where their parents traveled a lot and wanted them to be exposed to 2 or 3 languages at a time. It was fascinating to have those 3 different groups involved in that program. Unfortunately, that school closed because it was under a research grant, And it meant that there had to be 50% children that were deaf, 50% children that were hearing. And unfortunately, in Tucson, it was a small town, and the number of deaf children was not enough. And it was near the school for the deaf as well, so that made it more difficult. So unfortunately, they had to close down. So we're hoping another town sometime will open another center just like that.
In your opinion, what would be the ideal bilingual educational program for deaf children?
Ideal situation, okay. It would be really good to have a sign academy. You know, where ASL and English would be accepted, hearing children would be accepted. Hearing children, though, would have to be fluent in sign language. And the reason for that would be so that they don't lose focus. We want them to be able to focus on school and the concepts and content of school and not be lost in the language. We want their language to be part of their everyday life. You know, by first grade, they'd be doing fine, they'd be building confidence, and they'd have a wealth of knowledge through their socialization and interactions. Vygotsky, he and his team thought students could develop through peer interactions. And we become facilitators, almost like the Montessori method. Montessori approach or method really spread, and it becomes the student's responsibility to be their own learner and to follow the core standards. And they become critical thinkers, advocates for themselves. And that concept isn't old, it's just now coming back in to the education system again. And you don't just study to take a test. They study to learn and become wonderful thinkers and great contributors to our society. So I think it's very important for deaf and hearing children to be together in a sign academy. And they are both learning both languages, and that's what I envision to be ideal.
Do you have any advice for parents who just found out their child is deaf?
Yes, if a parent just found out their child is deaf, I think the number one piece of advice would be, this is your child. And they are very normal. And any child, they're no different than any other child other than the fact that they will be bilingual. They'll learn a second language, and that's it. How you discipline, how you interact with your child will be the same. And it's okay to feel like you have questions and to question why it's happened, but ask around. And ask for advice. Embrace the language. You want your children to learn to speak? That's fine, sure, of course. But don't discount ASL. It's a really important part of your child's life and yours as well. Both of you will have a much richer life having experienced ASL. Besides, it's a very beautiful language.
I don't have a question, but I just want to sincerely thank you for the work that you do.
You're welcome.